we start with the first session of the day, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our esteemed sponsors, including Microsoft, Soda Foundation, Google, Amazon Web Services, MySQL, Huawei, iText, GitHub, SUSE, Entrepreneur First India, and Ensemble Labs. Their support is what makes the event possible. Coming to the first keynote session today, the topic, a very interesting one. Is there an easy path to open source success? Jules Graybill, who's Director of Search Services at Amazon Web Services, is joining us for this panel. And he believes that the easy path to open source success does not exist. All over to you, Jules. I request the audience to post their questions on the Q&A box located on the right-hand side of their windows. Jules, please take over.
I'm going to be talking today about the easy path to open source success, doesn't exist, and other things I learned while launching OpenSearch. My name is Jules Graybill. I'm a technology leader at Amazon Web Services, and I wish I could meet you all in person. But in the meantime, I'll just start by introducing myself. I have been a technology leader for most of my career, but I actually got my start in a very different place. In college, I studied both computer science and cultural anthropology. And I chose cultural anthropology because it's just so interesting. When you study anthropology, you get to travel all over the world. You go to beautiful places, you meet really interesting people, eat dinner in their homes, and you really learn to challenge a lot of the assumptions and biases that you grew up with. You learn a lot about people. For my career, I chose computer science and technology because it pays. If you look at the job listings for cultural anthropology, there really are not very many. And I really just enjoy technology so much. In 1999, 22 years ago, I started working at a little online book company, Amazon.com, here in Seattle, Washington, where I still live with my family. As a technologist, I've been interacting with open source software my whole career. And I started working in tech at a time when I think the assumption was that if you're doing serious work, you were going to use a commercial Unix distribution. And before I came to Amazon, I worked on a project to migrate the whole stack at the company I was with from SGI IRIX to FreeBSD. And shortly after joining Amazon, we famously moved our entire website from SunOS to Linux. And at the time, these were really scary moves with a lot of uncertainty. It wasn't clear whether these Unix-like open source distributions were really production grade. Things have changed a lot since then. For the past 2 years, I've been working at Amazon Web Services at AWS, deeply entrenched in the open source world, working really hard exclusively in open source software. At AWS, I've had the benefit of having access to some really great thinkers, real luminaries, people who have worked in open source their whole careers at places like MongoDB, Redis, Red Hat, Apache Software Foundation. Something that they have in common is that they have deep, extensive knowledge of the issues and challenges and opportunities in open source. As someone who's been working in open source for 2 years, I just felt like I was learning from them all the time. And 2 years is probably less time than many of you have been working in open source. So it's hard for me sometimes to feel like I really have very much to teach. On the other hand, in those 2 years, I had a really unique experience. I was able to be hands-on involved in leading the launch of a large new open source project, which is OpenSearch. I'm going to take a quick diversion here. I'd like to think that everybody already knows the answer to this question, but some of you are probably asking, hey, Jules, what is OpenSearch? I'm so glad you asked. OpenSearch, it's a search engine. It's a community-driven open source search engine. It's derived from Elasticsearch, which is a famous open source search engine. It's been around for over 10 years. Elasticsearch and now OpenSearch are often used for search workloads, product search, website search. They're also really popular for log analytics and observability workloads. It turns out that you can dump all your logs into a search engine and query them and find out all kinds of really useful insights into how your systems are performing. So launching OpenSearch was just a crash course in open source project leadership. It was difficult and challenging in ways that nothing else I've ever worked on in software has been. And I found myself time and again going back to my training in anthropology, because a lot of the hardest challenges weren't technical challenges. They were people challenges. They were cultural challenges. And as you think about how you use open source software, how you contribute to it, how you lead it, I think that some of the lessons that I've learned in a very short period of time, in most cases the hard way, could be useful to you. So I want to offer them to you today. For me, the crux of it came down to trying to understand the right answer to this question. What is open source? And I think when I first started on this, the answer to me seemed really obvious. Open source is software. That's mostly how I experienced it, was as a user. I was choosing whatever the most useful software was for whatever problem I was trying to solve. And now as somebody producing software, the question that I want to be sure I can answer for users is this great software? Does it solve a problem that a lot of people have? Does it solve it in a high quality way? Is it performant? Is it robust? Is it easy to use? Is it powerful? To answer that question about OpenSearch, I need to take you back a little bit to the history of OpenSearch, where the project came from. I mentioned Elasticsearch. And Elasticsearch is often distributed with another open source project called Kibana, which is the web interface to Elasticsearch. It lets you visualize and query Elasticsearch data, the data you've stored in Elasticsearch in a really easy to use way. The maintainers of Elasticsearch and Kibana have offered open source builds of these products for a long time. And a couple of years ago, a lot of users started getting unhappy at the way that the maintainers were starting to intermingle open source and non-open source software in the same repository. This intermingling was sort of combining open source features and non-open source features, code for both. It made it hard to engage with this project as an open source project. You ran the risk of tripping over source code that wasn't open source. We were hearing a lot of requests from people that they wanted a full-featured, fully open source stack to be able to run Elasticsearch and Kibana. So what we did is we looked at what are the features that people are asking for? What are the features that seem to be missing? And we created Apache 2.0 licensed open source implementations of those features as plugins. Things that an administrator of a cluster might want: security, index state management, alerting, job scheduling, some really nifty machine learning based anomaly detection, K-neural network search for similarity search. We took a whole bunch of these open source plugins, plus the open source builds of Elasticsearch and Kibana, packaged them all up with an installer, and released it as open distro for Elasticsearch. It was an open source distribution for Elasticsearch. And it was a huge hit. Over the years, we released 23 releases of ODFE, as we call it. And really at every point, we were adding new features that were just what our customers and users were asking for. And that went really well. Earlier this year, though, we ran into a challenge, which was that the maintainers of Elasticsearch announced that they were going to stop releasing open source builds of Elasticsearch and Kibana, and they were going to convert the source code to a non-open source license, which meant that we could no longer include them in open distro. And when we heard about the license change, a lot of users were asking us for help, couldn't figure out what they wanted to do, and we made the decision that we were going to create forks of Elasticsearch and Kibana, and those forks were OpenSearch and OpenSearch dashboards. And these would be Apache 2.0 licensed, purely open source forks. We combined those with the same plugins that provided advanced functionality, bundled that all together with an installer, and called it OpenSearch. It was a really big step up in terms of what we were running. OpenDistro for Elasticsearch was about 0.8 million lines of code. OpenSearch was roughly 7 times that. And you know, the team suddenly, while we were familiar with the Elasticsearch code, suddenly become experts at a much larger code base and a much more complex code base. Which brings me to my second attempt to answer this question, because boy, while we were working on this project, I started to appreciate that open source is code. And specifically, when you're working in open source, you know, the software is part of the product, but the code is also part of the product. And that your end users, when they're deciding whether your software is something they're going to use, will go read your source code. And what they see there should be something that they have confidence in. Creating a fork of a product as big as Elasticsearch is not merely a matter of hopping into GitHub and pushing the fork. That's the first step. And what we found was that we had to do a lot more than that. First we hit fork, and then there's a lot of cleanup. The first thing we wanted to do was remove all the code that wasn't open source. And fortunately, that was nicely contained in one module called XPath. So RM, RF, XPath, done. Except that there are references to XPath all through the code base. So we go find and remove all those references. There are also API endpoints for things that are in the XPath. So, okay, go remove all those. A lot of the maintainers have been set up so that they could build an open source or a non-open source distribution. We didn't need that anymore. So we removed all of the build flavors, the built code that wasn't in the repo anymore. The maintainers had also had telemetry to help them understand what features the customers were using, how it was performing. It was pretty clear from the community that we were engaging with that the community didn't want telemetry in this product, so we removed it. There's also a lot of marketing content, things promoting the maintainer's commercial products. Again, not something relevant anymore. Remove all the marketing content. Then we had to rename it all. From Elasticsearch to, well, actually, while we were working on the rename, we didn't have a new name yet. We were still working on figuring out what the name was going to be. So everything had to go to a placeholder name. And then later, when we decided it was going to be called OpenSearch to the actual name. And last, change the version number to 1.0. And this turned out to be a massive headache because Elasticsearch does a really good job of staying backward compatible with old versions of Elasticsearch. So you change the version number to 1.0 and all kinds of parts of Elasticsearch start reverting to older behavior. They start expecting old behavior or old APIs. It took some real cleverness to have our project be version 1.0, but still act like Elasticsearch 7.10.2. Then the hard work began because making all of these massive changes to the code base effectively broke everything. So it was a matter of going back and getting it to all work. And we decided early on that we wanted to do this work in a way that was like really nicely documentable. So everything was done with documented PRs, pull requests that showed exactly what we were doing. There was that you could reproduce every step that we took. It was important to us to show the community how we were managing this code base. On top of this all, we needed to build infrastructure, continuous integration infrastructure, a test infrastructure, a backward compatibility testing infrastructure, performance testing infrastructure. Even though the code is public and the code is open source, the infrastructure isn't necessarily. One of the big tenets we had for the open source project, in fact, was that we were going to make the infrastructure public so that anybody could reproduce our entire infrastructure for the entire project. Make it easier for somebody who wants to create a fork of OpenSearch to do that. A key thing about this was that we were doing all this work while the repo was still private. We weren't doing it in public. And that was really hard for us. But because when you're running an open source project, you want to default to working in public. It's really important that you make decisions in public, that you show your work. But there are some things that need to be done by you, the maintainer, in private. And you should keep that minimal. There are some things though, like security, branding, signing certificates, that there are real procedures for how and when you share those things, and you should follow those. Everything else you should do in the public. For us, we felt that at every point, we wanted to be able to stand behind the code that was in the repo, even if it didn't compile yet. If it included, for example, telemetry, and we had already committed to removing telemetry, we didn't want to have to explain why telemetry was still in the repo. So we felt it was important to clean up the things that were there before we released it. But this is really tough. It was about 2.5 months from the time we started work to when we finally opened the repos. And we were getting a lot of tough feedback from the community, starting to wonder, where's OpenSearch? Is this thing vaporware or what? And that discomfort, I think, showed me yet another answer to my original question, which is that open source is also about community. Because you're doing all this work in the public eye, and your stakeholders can be involved in your project at any level they care to. And as much as the software is the product and the code is the product, the way that you work is also the product. How you engage with the community is part of the product. And we really focused on building community. What's tough about building community, especially I think for me as a software leader, is that it's not entirely under my control. I can try to lay the foundation, I can be supportive, but ultimately it's people's decision about whether they come join a community. Let me share some of the things that we did that I'm proud of that worked. One was we stated our principles. So especially in the early days of the OpenSearch project, the source code's coming together, things don't really build right. We're not doing everything perfectly. It's really hard for somebody coming from outside to even understand why we're making the decisions we're making. And when they can't understand why we're making the decisions we are, they could maybe assume the worst, try to interpret our actions. And we realized that we needed to be a lot more upfront about how are we thinking about things. What we did was we sat down and we thought about what are the principles that we're following? What are the principles we want to communicate? We wrote them down and we published them on the homepage of the website. And I can't recommend this practice enough. It's really helpful. Doing this, we wanted to be really thoughtful about every word of what we wrote, to be inclusive in the principles. These could be principles that would last for a long time, that weren't just how the team at AWS who was working on the project wanted to think about it, but something that as people from outside AWS joined, that they would be willing to participate in as well. I think when you state principles, something that's important is then to follow through, right? To show that you're following them. I think, we really try to make a point of when we make a decision that's guided by one of these principles, we point out that we're using the principle to make the decision. We point out which principle that we're using, so that it's really clear what our thought process is at all times. The principles that we decided on, and there are explanations of each on the website. When we're successful, OpenSearch will be great software. It'll be open source like we mean it, level playing field. It's going to be used everywhere. It will be made with your input. It will be open to contributions. It will be respectful, approachable, and friendly. And it'll be a place to invent. The second thing that worked really well was deciding how we were going to collaborate. There are so many collaboration tools available. Discord, IRC, email, Slack. And if you go try to use all of them, what you're going to find is that you immediately diffuse your community. People are communicating with each other all over the place. And so I think what I would say is choose one or choose two. Choose a small number and really invest in them. For OpenSearch, we chose message boards and GitHub issues. And the reason for it was that we wanted asynchronous communication. We wanted that to have the experience that every time the community answered a question for each other, that knowledge persisted and other people could see what had happened. And we also wanted to, when we made decisions or when we participated, we wanted that to be in a long-term record. Helped us, again, be consistent and showing our thinking and being transparent. There are a lot of other great available services that I would say it will help you to just use, buy rather than build. So we use these discourse message boards. We use meetup.com to arrange our community meetings. We use Zoom to hold the community meetings. There's Google Analytics on our website. We have a Docker Pro subscription for distributing Docker images. A lot of these services have reasonable or even free rates for open source projects. Look into it. They're popular in many cases for a reason, and they really ease your life as a maintainer. Listen to feedback from the community and value it. Act on it. Show that you care what the community is saying. There are a couple examples where we had to do something kind of tough because of community feedback. One was that early on, we switched our community meetings. We hold a community meeting every other week. And we switched it from Zoom meetings to webinar formats. The size was really getting a little bit out of hand. We were concerned about Zoom bombing or other disruptions. So we switched to a webinar format where we had a presenter and then a moderated Q&A. And the community hated it. It just hated it. We got tons of complaints. It was way too unidirectional. It was way too impersonal. And we tried to explain a few times about all the risks that we were trying to mitigate, and people just didn't care. They just hated the webinars. So we listened. We went and did the work, and we brought back our community meetings in the regular Zoom meeting format. They're a little bit more chaotic and a little more freewheeling, but actually the community really likes that. Another area we listened to the community was, you remember this chart that I showed earlier, or this graph that I showed earlier, thinking about how we distribute OpenSearch. So when Elastic, the maintainers of Elasticsearch and Kibana, offered Elasticsearch and Kibana as standalone Apache license downloads, a lot of software vendors and service providers built solutions around just this part. So they weren't using the full open distro toolkit. They were really just using Elasticsearch and Kibana that were open source. So when we built OpenSearch, a lot of those software developers asked us to provide a release that was just OpenSearch and just OpenSearch dashboards with no plugins included. And we resisted. This was a tough ask for us. The reason being because of what's missing from the red circles there, which is security. And we had a lot of discomfort providing software that didn't have security built in and enabled by default. I think it's just something that really mattered to us as maintainers, that we set up our end users to have a secure cluster by default. We explained this over and over. We had a lot of debate about it. But a lot of members of the community said, trust us, we know what we're doing. We've solved security on our ends. This really matters to us. So after a lot of deliberation, a lot of negotiation and debate, we reached a compromise, which is that on our download page, we offer what we call the minimal distributions. And those minimal distributions have a clear statement about what's included and what's not included. And in fact, we go even further. If you click the download button, we have another statement that really drives home the point that we do not suggest this distribution for end users. And this worked really well. This got a very positive response. The community members who wanted the minimum distribution could have access to it. The language was very clear. It was clear that we were educating and informing and trusting the community, and we've gotten really positive responses to this. The last thing that worked was publishing a code of conduct, and I really recommend that you do this. If you're going to interact with your community, you need to go define what's going to be acceptable conduct and do that right up front. In the early days of the project, we did have one incident where we needed to go warn somebody that some of the communication they were doing in community forums was not compatible with the code of conduct. Having it there already helps us make that a really clear, understandable warning, and that user corrected the behavior, and we haven't had a problem since. So I think you can avoid a lot of trouble if you just define this early. Okay, that's the stuff that worked. Not everything worked, though. Let me talk about what did. There were a few cases where community members felt really strongly that we should do something, and we tried it, and it didn't work so hot. A handful of community members got together and created a Slack channel, for example. And they let us know about it. We promoted it. But by the time they had created the Slack channel, really the center of gravity for the community was in the message boards. And so it just never really picked up, and that Slack channel isn't used very much. But, no harm. Another community member really advocated that we create some sort of collaborative note-taking for the community meetings. So we found a website that offers collaborative note-taking. You can, at the start of the meeting, provide a link to a page where everybody can co-edit a document. It doesn't really get edited very much. It does a little bit. Again, we re-promote it every few weeks. But it's okay if some of the community-led experiments don't pan out. Just doing them at all shows that you're listening. Governance debates were some of the toughest debates in the whole project. Governance is something that is really important for an open source project, to have clear, documented governance practices. And if you want to be community-led and a community project, those governance processes need to include the community. But they really have, it's slow, deliberate, thoughtful work. And I think as much as all of us wish we could just race to the finish line and produce a full governance plan that is baked and ready to go, it just takes a lot more work than that. And that was always hard. And a lot of the discussions and debates, I think, were emotional and not very productive. Voting on things, we tried voting on questions early on in the project, and it was a disaster. We would be trying to decide between implementation A or implementation B of something, and we would go to the message boards and we'd ask, hey, everybody vote, do you want A or B? And a bunch of people would vote, and then we'd count the votes up and say, okay, everybody decided on A, and hooray. But what that did is that everybody who had voted for B now felt like, well, they were the losers. They had just expressed what they wanted, and we told them we weren't going to do it. Voting creates winners and losers. That's sort of what it is. And so it helped us make decisions fast, but it left a whole bunch of people in the community feeling shut up. So we learned that we really need to step back quite a bit. Not ask people how they want something implemented, but ask the community what problems they're trying to solve, what their concerns are. And when they tell us that, we can do our best to invent a solution that isn't that doesn't involve trade-offs, that isn't a win-lose solution, but is a win-win solution. So it takes more time, and you have to be more thoughtful, and you have to think a lot harder about it, but try not to make decisions through voting. Another answer to the question about what's open source that I want to touch on, which is that open source is about licenses. And I think I believed this one really strongly at the start of the project, and I still do. What's great about open source licenses is that regardless of what you as a maintainer do, your end users and all your stakeholders always maintain a certain set of rights, and important rights. If you do something with a project and a community of people, want to take the project in a different direction, they have the right to create a fork. And that's really amazing. That has resulted in a lot of amazing software being created over the last several years. I think I've learned, though, that the existence of that right, in theory, isn't enough. Because you, as the maintainer of a project, you know that creating a fork of your project is just really hard. And you have built, hopefully, momentum, you've built community, you've built expertise. There's a center of gravity around your project that does mean you have a responsibility to listen to your community and try to run your project in a way that works for them. I'm going to talk the least about licensing. This is an area where I think a lot of very thoughtful people have made whole careers out of crafting open source licenses. It has been a huge benefit for our project that we're able to say we use the Apache license 2.0. A lot of our stakeholders understand what that license is. They understand the rights that it grants. And we don't have to spend a lot of time educating and debating those rights. We can focus our energy on the other parts of the project that are needed to make it successful. So I'm really grateful that this license exists. I'm grateful to the people who've developed these. And I think they're important, but also insufficient. The last thing that I tried on is that open source is about being open. And for somebody who's worked at a corporation for most of my career, this is a really big shift. It was a huge shift to use open tools for all of our work. When we're thinking about a new feature, we publish a request for comments, an RFC, and we get a lot of feedback on our thoughts. And we have to really think hard about how we incorporate that feedback. It makes the work a little bit more deliberate, a little slower, and it's a lot more exposed. But every time that we've leaned toward being open, it's worked well for us. One of the early pieces of feedback we were getting from the community was they just didn't know what our plans were for OpenSearch. And so we published a project roadmap. This is on GitHub. And the way to look at it is every column is a release of OpenSearch. On the far left is the currently available release, OpenSearch 1.0.1. And every column to the right is a subsequent release. Within every release, there are cards, and each card is a major feature. And every card is also linked to an issue describing that feature so that anybody can go get more details. They can make comments, provide feedback, ask questions. Those issues then link to the PRs so people can see the code that implements the feature. We made the very tough decision that this was going to be a working document. There isn't a separate roadmap that we look at internally and move things over to this one. When our plans change, we update this in real time. It is really scary to go change the date that we plan to make a release on and to do that in public and try to explain why, hey, we had been estimating one date, we wanted new things, we're not going to make it. What we found, though, is that the community is great about it. They prefer the transparency to having us only commit to dates once we have 100% certainty that we're going to make them. Another thing that we've done is we've committed to use semantic versioning. it really is a real restraint. It means that we have to be, we have to use, in the way that we version the software, we have to show the community where it's safe to assume that you can do sort of an easy upgrade from version to version. I think we are often tempted to try to sneak a feature into a patch release, but we know that if we're going to have this contract with the community so they understand how we're versioning our software, we have to abide by it ourselves. We tried this experiment. We were getting a bunch of feedback from people and hearing about projects that they had built using OpenSearch, and they wanted to let the rest of the community know about. So we created this page on the website. It just had a couple of projects on it when we launched it, and we made it a self-service thing. Anybody could go fork the website, create a pull request, and add their own project to this page. And we had no idea how well it was going to work or not. Would it be totally empty and be kind of embarrassing? Would it be full of spam? It turns out it's actually been great. There are a handful of really neat projects on here. People get to show off the things that they've done with OpenSearch. I think it really shows how useful and versatile this tool is. In fact, after this page really started to take off, we created another page for partners, people who were building businesses that used OpenSearch, either as a managed service or things that worked with OpenSearch. Again, sort of some concern that this would turn into something kind of unpleasant or weird or spammy, but it's been really nice. We're making steps toward community governance. I talked about governance before, how hard it is, and with a code base of 20 million lines of code, having it possible for somebody in the community to meaningfully lead that is tough. There's a lot of stuff to work out. But what we realized was that this project is actually made up of a lot of smaller sub-projects, and a lot of those smaller sub-projects, those individual repos, actually were ready for community leadership. So the first one on the left here that we opened up to the community was a plugin template. This great developer, Amitai, wrote a blog post basically educating people about how to create an OpenSearch plugin, and he provided sample code in a repo. We invited him to bring that repo into the project. He is an admin on the repo, and we've worked out with Amitai, what does it mean to be an admin on this project that is, this larger umbrella. And he's been really helpful in helping us figure that stuff out. For the last few weeks, we've started launching clients and SDKs for popular programming languages, Python, Java, Ruby, Rust, to make it easy to access OpenSearch data from within those programming languages. This is another great opportunity, we thought, for community involvement. We invited community members who had a passion about one of these languages or clients to come work as co-maintainers. And we got great response. There are a lot of co-maintainers on this. And this is another way in which the community being involved in the SDKs and the clients, that really then has trickle-down effects over the whole project. We're learning a lot. Like I said, this is really deliberate work. But what we've seen is that the more that we get the community involved, the more people show up and want to help out. So over the last few weeks, we've seen people contribute helmet charts for OpenSearch. They've been helping with artifacts and operating systems that they care about. Somebody did a port of OpenSearch to FreeBSD just recently. We're seeing that the community wants to shape this project. They want to turn OpenSearch into the thing that they want it to be. And the more we let them do that, and the more we create opportunities for them to do that, the better the product is, the better the community is. And I think overall, it's kind of the dream. It's what I've been hoping would happen. So tell me after this question, what is open source? A lot of people, I think, want to take a reductive or essentialist answer to this question. There's one core thing. If you can understand that core thing, you'll get all of open source right. And what I learned really was that just wasn't possible in practice. In practice, open source is all of these things. And what I would say for you is, as you're thinking about working in open source, take the expansive view. Think about how you excel at every dimension of open source. For me, I would say where I land is that it's a movement. It is something that involves many, many dimensions and many people. I heard someone say a while ago that if you really look over the long term, basically all software will become open source software. And from that point of view, we are in the early days. There's a lot of software to be written. I'm really glad to be on this journey with all of you. I can't wait to see what you make. And in fact, I would encourage all of you to reach out to me, introduce yourself, and show me what you're working on. I can't wait to hear from you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jules. That was a wonderful, wonderful session. Thank you for sharing knowledge from around open source as a leader. Audience, the next session here starts in around 5 minutes. And just give us 5 more minutes and we'll be back.